to YouTube. Hope everyone's having a lovely day. Just one more moment and we can start. All right. Okay, great. There we go. All right, great. Good evening. Welcome to the New York Studio School's virtual evening lecture series. This is our 15th lecture of the spring. It's our penultimate lecture and our final artist lecture of this season. So it's always an honor to close with an esteemed artist such as Clifford Ross, who we're joined with tonight, presenting Clifford Ross, Provocations and Inspirations. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us tonight. And I would like to thank Clifford for being here and being part of the New York Studio School's Spring Evening Lecture Series. I would also like to just quickly recognize that the New York Studio School Evening Lecture Series is generously supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the Robert Lehman Foundation, and many individual contributors. Please do consider making a donation either during or after tonight's talk by clicking on the support button on our homepage at www.nyss.org and then just click on donate. I will introduce Clifford in just one moment, but I just want to draw your attention to the bottom of your screen. You'll see a Q&A button. Please feel free to enter a question at any time during the talk, and we'll leave some time afterwards to address those. And if you're on YouTube, go ahead and put a question or a comment in the comments section, and we'll be able to get to those as well. Okay. Clifford Ross is a multimedia artist who graduated from Yale in 1974 with a degree in art and art history. He painted and sculpted for 20 years, turning to photography and advanced computer animation in the mid-1990s. By 2017, while continuing his multimedia work, he began painting again. His work focuses on the beauty and sublime qualities of nature, using both realistic and abstract means. His work is in the collections of many museums, including the Museum of Modern Art, the Getty Museum, and the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. And in 2015, Mass MoCA presented a major mid-career retrospective. And Clifford Ross currently has an exhibition titled Clifford Ross Prints on Wood at Ryan Lee Gallery in Chelsea, which is on view until May 15th. So if you're in the city, I hope you have the chance to see that. And with that, please join me in a virtual welcome for Clifford Ross.
So thank you, Sam. And thank you to Graham Nixon, the leader of the New York Studio School. I've known Graham for too many decades to count. And I don't know how long ago it was, I was invited to do another lecture. And to do something with the New York Studio School is it's a wonderful opportunity. The core audience, of course, of the students and the community of the school, but really there's a chance through these webinars, whatever they're called, to reach more of an audience. So welcome to any other folks who have come. When Graham first talked to me about this, we were talking about the fact that there's a great Goya show that opened at the Met. And he said, maybe you want to talk on Goya. And I thought, well, that's good. It's refreshing, so I don't have to talk about my own work. And then as we talked, it turned out actually Graham wanted me to talk a little bit about my own work. So I decided to have some fun this evening by picking some artists and artworks that meant something to me, that, as the title sort of suggests, either provoked me or inspired me. One friend of mine, in response to the email he got, said, Jesus, Clifford, Rembrandt and Barnett Newman, pretty heady stuff. So I want to make it very clear that I'm not trying to compare my work to theirs. This is very much a question of what things have knocked my socks off and sort of helped form the path to my own art making. Let's see, I'm having a little trouble with the Um, there we go. So I realized when I was thinking about this that the most important thing for me is not any kind of fancy analytic about the work, whether it is a formalist analysis or it's politics or anything, but it's that phrase of getting my socks knocked off. I like coming to a piece of work, and whether it is immediately or after a period of time, really being stunned. And as I began to do this, the first work I thought of was a work that had a huge impact on me early on when I was still in college. William Bailey was my teacher. And I really knew nothing about making art. I stumbled into it. I had no intention of being an artist when I went to college. And Bailey one day said, go to the Frick. And so I ran into this painting at the Frick. I was probably about 19 years old, maybe 18. And I stood in front of it. I don't know, I'd probably been to the Frick as a kid. And I looked at this thing and I was sort of in disbelief because it's completely harmonic. I completely believe that this guy was, Nicolaus Rutz, I think is his name, it was sort of standing there very dignified in front of me. And I became intrigued with, how the hell did this guy do it? And I began to move in on the picture until my nose was about a foot away. And I was staring at the thumb very, very closely. And I felt a hand grab my shoulder. And it was a security guard hauling me backwards. But what I was riveted on was the fact that I could stare at that thumb. And then if I stared for a little while longer, suddenly it would turn into paint. And I began to have this giddy feeling that sometimes it was a thumb, sometimes it was paint. And it was like a conundrum. And as I stepped back, courtesy of the guard, I realized that this miracle of depth and atmosphere and personality and texture, I was just looking at a flat canvas with paint on it. And that fairly simplistic view is probably the essential element to my fascination with art in general. Okay, a little bit of a change. So, some of you may recognize this. It's obviously, I'm sure everybody recognizes Mickey Mouse. This little film was called Steamboat Willie, and it was the first animated film by Walt Disney. And the reason I throw this in is really to kind of stir up the discussion and the idea pot, make a big stew. I do believe in high art. I believe that art is a very important and spiritual pursuit. And whether the pursuit is making it or the pursuit is finding it to appreciate it. But the definition of art has to be wide. And there's a lot of popular culture that still qualifies as art. And this sort of a breakthrough in terms of making magic, making a sense of wonder. Imagine thinking that a creature, a little mouse, could have a personality. Imagine realizing that you could make an entire world out of single cells and stringing them together. And on top of that, with that sort of liberation, you could make, the horns, those steam horns on the top of Steamboat Willie's boat, have anthropomorphic qualities. And I think it's really important to remember when you're trying to engage a work, be open to anything. And that's true for making your art as well. But I think Rembrandt and Mickey Mouse or I should say Rembrandt and Walt Disney are very good bedfellows. I was determined to sort of make a roller coaster ride for myself and for you. And this amazing sculpture, which I think I first saw, I believe it's in Athens, but it's a very early Greek figure. These kuroi were really the beginnings of what flowered ultimately with the remarkable Hellenistic work later, and then what the Romans did after the Greeks. But in 590 BC, this is where they had gotten to. And, you know, it has this immense power. It's iconic. And there's a conundrum to it, just like there was in the Rembrandt, because as stylized as it is, it has a presence which speaks of a man standing. Its power and the feeling of realism is way beyond what its aspect is. So you can imbue even abstract work with an incredible sense of spirit. And if you notice, the feet are about 1 foot apart, something like that. It took about 150 to 200 years for them to get from the first iteration, where the feet were side by side, to this. 150, 200 years is a long time and a lot of work to move that 1 foot. This next slide is 200 years later. And here, it's not just celebrating what Polykleitos did. It's really one of the truly great early figures in the history of art. But the sense of realism has come such a long way. And, you know, these things don't necessarily happen. Sometimes there's an inspirational leap, but a lot of the time, art is about going in and doing your work. Go to the studio, do your work, even if it's a bad day. And, you know, for 200 years, artists were having bad days and good days, but they got from this to that. And in terms of having one's socks knocked off, either one of these sculptures certainly does it. The vitality is staggering, and the sense of it being a real figure, even though it's sculpted out of marble, it's you can feel the flesh. And there are moments when you are in front of it where you almost feel that you are in the presence of a live figure breathing, about to step off the pedestal. So I like to shift around with different favorites and different media, because I really think the more fluidly we can think about art and the wider our inspirations, the richer the opportunities are for us. I'll talk a little bit about it after the clip, but this is a clip from a movie called Fitzcarraldo by Werner Herzog. The voice you hear is Werner's actually talking about this particular bit of his film.
And this is one of the, for me, one of the very mysterious shots in the film, where it's just staying there and disappearing.
Was that one that you staged, or that just happened?
No, we staged it. And this is one of my favorite shots.
Very eerie.
And that is something, some poetry that you can put into films that doesn't exist anywhere else. It doesn't exist in literature like this, or it doesn't exist in other media. You can do it on film and nowhere else. And that's why I love to do films.
Every time I see this shot and listen to him, I just end up bowled over and smiling. He is such a brilliant, innovative artist. And I think one of the key elements of this for me is how he has celebrated the fact that his medium of film can do certain things that other media can't. Or if we do approach it as painters, let's say, we have to find an equivalent. But the idea of that horse, which has a cowl on it, and then slowly as the boat is moving, the horse is disappearing. And of course, that striking close-up of Klaus Kinski's face, which is just so powerful. It's an incredible moment of mystery. And whatever medium we are working in, whatever medium we're looking at, very often there's a correspondence between the specific abilities of a medium, even how they're pushed into new areas, how hard that push has been sort of projected, that often can help define how great the artwork is. And with Herzog, he has such a command of the medium that when he's using it, he has the ability to put emotions into things that lesser filmmakers don't have. And sometimes it's very simple things like understanding what he can do in that shot. Whoops. So I don't know, art is, I guess, the focus of what we're talking about, but I'm going to just put human achievement in there also. This is a photograph which was taken and arranged. The photographer was brought in by Orville and Wilbur Wright in Kitty Hawk. They were bicycle repairmen, and I think it was it Orville or Wilbur? I've now forgotten. Literally woke up one morning with an idea that it would be really great to learn how to fly for humanity. It's such an outrageous thing to wake up in the morning with. And of course, that's why I love it. And he actually wrote a little note to his father, which still exists, telling his father that that's what he and his brother were going to do. And sure enough, they did it. They did it without knowing much about science. They were bicycle repair guys. And what they did is they made a list of ideas, and they kept altering the list as new ideas came up, and they would work on whatever ideas floated to the top as the most important. And they had a lot of crashes. It took them quite a few years to do this. But in 1903, this flight occurred, and it was the first flight by man that was not with, say, a hotter than air balloon or something like that. It was self-propelled flight. And I think as sort of a leap of imagination, it's worth remembering even in the context of making art. In fact, if you go down to the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., you might be there going to the National Gallery, but take a little trip over to that other museum. That amazing plane is there, or it was rebuilt. And it's such a thing of beauty. And in the country, I actually paint near a wonderful artist named Brian Hunt, who had a whole phase of work where he made these zeppelins and airships. And I often think it's not that far a distance between what Wilbur and Orville Wright did with their imagination and the world that we artists inhabit. So in the hopes of keeping things stirred up, this is a favorite painting of mine by Caspar David Friedrich, a German romantic painter. German romanticism can be somewhat overbearing and even obvious at times for me, but Friedrich is so deeply felt, and it's so clear that he's just determined to show you some element of the sublime and the mysterious, that anyway, I fell for him early, I fell for him hard. And this particular painting really, in terms of a way of thinking about how art can be made, as you know, a sense of wonder is a big thing for me. Here's a painting of a guy clearly enjoying a great vista. In my fantasies, of course, he's overcome with wonder. He's holding himself up with his cane, just not to be a dandy, but because his socks are being knocked off even inside his boots. But it became a very meaningful painting for me because of a remarkable essay about abstract expressionism by the critic Robert Rosenblum. And if we go from this image to this, you'll begin to see the translation. Robert wrote a piece in 1961 called The Abstract Sublime. And he talks about people in front of great abstract expressionist pictures. And this is a painting at MoMA called Vir Heroicus Sublimis. It is probably Barnett Newman's most famous painting. And Robert Rosenblum analyzes it in a very simple way, where one stands in front of this and one is engulfed by the red. There is a simple mystery about Barnett Newman's famous zips, these very simple, slightly textured vertical lines. And one essentially gets lost in the redness. And it is not dissimilar, if one is open to the experience, to what I imagine Caspar David Friedrich's figure is experiencing in front of the landscape. hence the concept of the abstract sublime. That was in an amazing catalog for a show in 1974 at the Met about American art. And that, besides looking at art and finding it clearly inspirational, the right kind of art writing is equally fueling for me. And that piece by Rosenblum is top of the heap. As just an example of shifting styles and but carrying the same theme of the sublime, this is a painting called Autumn Rhythm. It's in the Metropolitan Museum. I think it is always hanging. It's one of the greatest paintings Pollock ever painted. He painted it at the height of his powers when he was painting all of his great drip pictures. If one stands in front of this, like the figure you saw standing in front of the Barnett Newman, if you are open to witnessing the picture as one witnesses nature, not necessarily caught up in all the Sturm und Drang and the drama about Pollock and who he was, and just feel the painting. Like it or don't like it, but feel the picture. And ever since I first saw it, I found myself feeling like that adventurer in the Alps. And to this day, it's still one of the things, if I go to the Met to look at Greek sculpture or Cézanne or a Monet water lily or great Persian miniatures, I'll often try to find a moment to see this picture. It's a real palate cleanser. It just clears your thoughts and your feelings. And if you have a minute, get up to the Met, see the Goya show, and don't miss this. The next thing I want to show you is one of the answers that I've made for myself about how do I deal with the question of wonder. So let's see if I can, I guess I can't bring it back with a still. We'll leave this on. What you just saw was a work of mine called Light Waves 2. Some of you may be aware of my work. I don't always presume that, but certainly the most known works of mine probably are photographs I take in the ocean of hurricane waves. And I became obsessed with the fact that whatever I did with my black and white photos, clearly they were lacking movement. And I tried and failed to film waves. It was a disaster. And one day I came across somebody who knew something about some very sophisticated animation. And I hired him immediately. And we spent about 3 years building a deep video world. That was all computer generated. They're projected or fed to an LED wall. And we figured out basically how to break apart the software and rebuild it for my own needs. Hollywood uses about 400,000 dots and strings them together to make the ocean. We put 3 million dots, 3.2 million dots in motion at once to make our world. What you saw was a little documentary video. Those were not actors. It's just staggering. That was real. Children go up to these LED walls and they touch them. And it's clear, it was one of the best moments of my life when I saw these two kids. They were wandering around for a while. Somebody else was filming the walls and they touched it. And I thought, you know, that's my definition of wonder, if I can engage children like that. And I've been fortunate to do a number of these installations. So I'm going to shift gears for a moment. I found early on that different things that interested me were colliding. They were inconsistent with each other. They were at war with each other. And I pretty early on had to make peace with the fact that art is about things in conflict and resolving them. The conflict may be small or the conflict may be big, but the idea of a dialectical occurrence is really part and parcel of my understanding of art. And I've found it in various ways. So this painting is by Arthur Dove, an American modernist who I think is a magician. This particular painting, I think it's called just Sunrise, and it's pretty evident, you know, boom, there's your sun. But what is the rest of this? And what he did with the world is he abstracted in his mind certain essences while he still needed to hang on to some element of the real world, and he put it together. And even if I see a bad Arthur Dove, there is this sort of amazing feeling for me that this fellow has managed to combine the real world with the abstract. And there is an inherent collision there. And when you see a great Dove in person, it's not just the image, but he found a way to work with oil paint, mixing it with wax, which allowed a certain sort of warmth to enter into his paintings. And I wish I could share texture with you in this little talk, but maybe it'll make you curious enough to go visit with Arthur Dove. Another American modernist who I hold in sort of up there in the pantheon is Marsden Hartley. And a curator at the Met, Randy Griffey, I believe curated this show that was at the Met, but what was it called then? It was called the Met Breuer. And there were 3 paintings of waves, magnificent large paintings right next to each other. And this was the one that just thrilled me the most. And in a way, he's just a few steps towards the real world from where Arthur Dove was. But this is by no means a realistic depiction of a wave. But just as Dove certainly gave me an incredible depiction of the warmth and the sort of effulgence of the sun, this for me is one of the great depictions of a wave. But there's so much just raw paint and abstract sensibility in this. It's a crazy great picture. And you know, you just stare at it forever. And it brings me back to that early conundrum I had with the Rembrandt, where sometimes I'm looking at paint just, you know, flowing across the surface. And at other moments, I'm believing there's a wave. And that's a big piece of excitement for me. This for me is probably my favorite collision. We're looking at the Duomo, the central cathedral in Florence. And the lower part, it's a little hard to make out in these 2 slides, but they're the best I could find at the moment. The lower part, which you can see, it looks sort of black and white, it's actually green and white marble, was built by the citizenry and the architects of the moment during a sort of late Gothic period. When they built the lower part of this church, they had no way to erect the dome on top of it. But the culture had such faith in themselves, perhaps almost at an arrogant level. They believed somebody was going to come along and solve the problem. But if you can imagine building a cathedral this big and not knowing how to put the hat on it, it's just staggering in itself. The faith in culture and invention to come. Maybe we could all be a little optimistic that way right now. The guy that came along to figure it out was a guy named Brunelleschi, and there was a competition. The biggest problem was mechanical. No one could figure out how to literally build the dome. The technique that the Romans used to build the Pantheon in Rome had been lost. And he figured out a way, he presented it to the town elders. They couldn't quite buy into it. So he had to make 2 or 3 presentations. There's a great little book on it called Brunelleschi's Dome for anybody that's interested. And it's just one of the great dramas of all time. And obviously he won the competition. And what's striking to me about this is that it's the most ridiculous and inventive collision that I know of. Here are these red tiles with these white marble ribs with this really quite crazy little top to it. And what in God's name gave Brunelleschi the vision to realize that the color and the form could be so inconsistent with the base, and yet it would work as an overall harmony. And really, although we're looking at it from a hillside sort of just outside Florence, the real miracle is when you're in the streets and you're going through a narrow twisting street, and all of a sudden at the end of the street, you see this green and white, generally rectangular looking set of forms. And at the top, there's a flying piece of a white arc with red tile next to it. And talk about a sense of wonder. This is about as wondrous, I think, as architecture and art can get. So here's a sort of a bringing down to scale and trying to get out to some other cultures. The piece on the right it's a Dan African spoon in the form of a woman. Those were made by the tribes and by clearly remarkable artists within those tribes to give to women had enormous power. And even though there might have been a king within the tribe, the king's wife presided over these very important meals and dinners when visiting dignitaries came. And these were the ceremonial spoons. And so they were vested with enormous power. And they are intensely feminine in their aspect, whether it's, I mean, literally in this case, the genitalia, but there is this powerful female presence beyond that particular essence. And some of you may be looking at this and thinking of a great sculpture of Giacometti's, entitled, in fact, Spoon Woman. And it was toward the end of his Surrealist period. And he was very inspired by these remarkable sculptures. And we look at them today in our world that we have lived in, changing now for the better. But we look at these as sculptures. And when they were made, these were objects that were used. One would have held onto the legs and scooped food with it. And I think it's really important to remember as we, from one culture, look at another, that we need to try to remember what we're looking at and what it meant to another culture, because we can learn an awful lot through that. The little character on the left is from about, I think it's about 400 BC. And it is from northern Pakistan. And it is the most sort of lyric depiction of a powerful female that I have ever seen. I thought, if these things could be pictured together, to see how they would talk to each other. So again, in terms of a dialectic, here are 2 extraordinarily powerful women made of different materials with different functions. No one really knows. This was probably some sort of a burial figure, but they're not sure yet what it is. But it's a glorious collision. I feel like they are almost dancing with each other. Here's an ultimate sort of arc, a little different than a collision. We're looking at 2 paintings by Titian, who is really one of my 2 favorite painters at the end of the day. The painting on the left is a relatively early painting of his, of a Madonna. And it is certainly steps beyond a pure higher Renaissance depiction. But it is extremely realistic. I believe it's in the Accademia in Venice. And when you are in front of it, there is such a feeling of beauty and warmth, and that juxtaposition of that that landscape with the blues that's called sfumato, where it just disappears into blue, the blue atmosphere, and that amazing, probably silk fabric in back of the figures. It's a stunning figure, pair of figures. The remarkable thing about Titian, he lived a very long life, especially for that period. He lived into his 90s. The painting on the right is called The Flaying of Marsyas. And the painting miraculously was in New York for an exhibition that was put on about unfinished work, which always sort of offended me in a certain way. I don't know what finished means to the curators there, but this is an absolute masterwork. I have absolutely no doubt that it was finished. But by the time he got to be 90, he felt he needed to rely on the real world a lot less. Unfortunately, this particular slide is more vibrant. It's much darker and much more obscure, and in its abstraction could nuzzle right up to that Arthur Dove. But that idea of that arc across time is amazing, from beginning to end of his career. Cézanne, my other big hero, is the reverse. He started with a lot of overt emotion, very dark, and he ended up with an almost a Mozartian purity with Mont Saint-Victoire. I threw this in because I like to encourage people to go deep. I went and stood at every place that had been identified that Cézanne had ever painted his mountain, because I just wanted to see what he saw. It's my shadow, and it is a long leap when you're standing there between the real world and what Cézanne painted, but we believe in that mountain. I also, in the old days, you could go into his studio and there would be nobody to tell you to step back. And I have to admit that I hope no law officers are listening. The hat back there is Cézanne's famous bowler hat. And I picked up the hat and I put it on my head. I had to see what it felt like. It was the most transgressive thing I've probably ever done. But it's really worth getting as close as you can to your heroes. I'm going to move along a little quickly because I see we're sort of running out of time. This was a painting, Northern Sung painting by Fan Guan, printed in the 11th century, I believe. And this was the beginning of my understanding scale. It is in the Taiwan National Museum, not on mainland China. And what we're going to do is we're going to begin to zoom in on the bottom, and you'll notice there's some figures and some donkeys in the lower right. And we zoom in a little closer, and when we get all the way in, you can make out that little figure there with his backpack, the figure's being dissolved by the silk texture. That figure is at the bottom of this. So in terms of telegraphing scale, this was a hell of a lesson. And I learned it early on in an art history class, and it stayed with me. This is a photograph I took of a mountain in Colorado, but I took the lessons of Fan Guan along with the lessons of the Hudson River painters. And I actually built a camera to take this picture, and because I wanted to deal with all the details that I could see. And just to give you a sense, this is how detailed the image is. And I wanted to create that sense of awe from detail to large scale that I found really inspiring in other artworks. Periodically, things happen, and it can throw you for a loop, knock you off your course. I spent about 5 years making just 14 photographs of that mountain. And I was pretty worn out, and I was feeling almost tired, I think, without realizing it, about the real world. And I ran into 19th century paper negatives. I'd never seen them before. This is about maybe 14 by 20 inches of the Taj Mahal, a place I'd never been. And a friend of mine, Hans Kraus, a wonderful dealer in 19th century photography, introduced me to these images, and I believed I was looking at the Taj Mahal, and yet here was this sort of roughed up and altered paper negative. But it so shook me that I went and had paper made so I could take one of my mountain images and printed on handmade paper as a black and white negative. And I've been working on this one mountain now. Actually, some of the work behind me is residues still of that mountain. And what I did with this mountain at a certain point was think again of Fan Guan. And I thought, with a wonderful opportunity up at Mass MoCA, that I might actually make more real what Fan Guan had suggested to me. There was probably 30 years in between seeing the Fan Guan and making this work. It's 114 feet long, and it's just one image printed on 90 panels of wood. One other sort of obsession is that connection between the real world and what I want to do. And here's a little element of what I do to get the real world. So when I say get the real world, it's not just get the picture, it's get the feeling. And the digital waves, the light waves that you saw earlier were one more attempt to share with the world what I experienced in the ocean. The black and white photographs obviously became a primary way for me to deal with it. I mentioned scale earlier. I figured out a way to print on wood at a scale so people could feel more of what I felt when I was in that ocean roped up. This is a real U-turn in terms of reality. These are a bunch of objects that I found in my old professor William Bailey's studio when I went to interview him about 2 or 3 months before he passed away. And I saw these and I literally couldn't believe my eyes because I'd known his paintings for a long time. This is one of his still lifes. What's amazing about what Bill did is that he did not set up a still life and then painted it. He found objects across a lifetime and would study them off and on. But when he was painting them, sometimes those objects weren't even in the room he was painting in. He could have painted this in his place in Italy, and the objects could have been sitting in New Haven. So he was in so many ways an inspiration for me because of his steadfastness and his pursuit of something and his pursuit of the real world. This was his above his desk. And in terms of sort of having inspiration from other art, Bill's little mood wall, or whatever we want to call it, is quite something. From Matisse to Bellini, from El Greco to Georges Braque, and Pierrot, and friends of his like Leland Bell. It's a beautiful thing to see what other artists are interested in. And de Kooning, I see. We're sort of near the end, so I'm going to go a little quickly through this, but composition, color, and movement are other elements of things that I feel can inspire me. And I put together a few things that, as a brew, went into a big project of mine, which I'll show you at the end. This is a mid-period Titian, and obviously there's plenty of color, there's a lot of movement, but the key to this one is the decanter of wine and that small, horizontal, still moment in the midst of all the rest. And with this great, amazing painting of Braque, I think it's a Braque, all of that movement set off against not only the outside rectangles of the painting, but the interior verticals and horizontals. It's an incredible lesson in how to depict movement. Leger, who grew from what Picasso and Braque had achieved, added color in his own way. And again, all of that movement, all of that excitement and color, he's careful to give you moments of quiet, moments of horizontality, moments of vertical that are pure, which gives more life to the movement. Kandinsky, for me, his greatest period. And it's almost beyond imagination how he broke down the real world into full abstraction. He was almost at full abstraction with a painting like this. But again, you can see the necessity of calming down the activity by some gesture. I'll just leave that to speak for itself. And that Renaissance painting has a lot of rock and roll in it, I think. Kenneth Noland on the right, Rothko on the left. And in terms of color, this is the second room in the orangerie of Monet's Water Lilies. And these issues of color and movement are what gave birth to this, which I may cut a little bit short so we can get some questions. I'll just say that that was at Mass MoCA. All of those bits of color were one tiny little piece of my mountain image. I'm still trying to figure out ways to express that mountain, and that one was with color and movement. I'm gonna, I think, probably have to skip Sam Levy's out there, I think, to answer some questions. I'll just flip through these without commenting, but it has to do with how I got in 1978 from where I was, and I saw Goya at the Prado in 1979, and it literally shattered my painting into bits and pieces. And I began to do work. Those little scratch marks were the people fleeing in front of the Colossus. And I made 40 little works called Landscapes for the Colossus. And Goya has blown me up twice, thank God. And what's behind me at the moment is how he blew me up recently. It started before the Goya show went up, and it's a show you should see. Maybe I can find the, that's what's there now. So go to the Met, see Goya, and get blown up in the best way. Sam, do you want to take over? I don't know how to push the right button for that. I hope you do.
Thank you, Clifford. This is stunning, very interesting talk. Thank you. We are, as Clifford said, we can definitely take some questions. So I see we've got a few already in, but if you want to click on the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, you can just put in a question, and we'll take some as long as Clifford would like to. Several people are saying how fantastic the talk and stunning it was, Clifford. So bravo. Let's see. Christina Strassfield is asking, she says, Clifford, you have worked in many mediums. Have you ever considered making a full-length film?
You know, I don't do narrative very well. I think I became a visual artist in part because I couldn't tell stories. I love the movies and I love the great narratives. I'm a sucker for them. I'd love to be a DP or handle the camera for a great filmmaker, but I don't think I'm the guy to do that unless it was a full-length, very abstract work.
Daniel Mason is wondering, when you print on wood, is it a digital printing process or a chemical process?
It is digital. I use actually a very, very large commercial printer for the large works. We actually are putting sheets of full plywood through it's ultraviolet cured ink. It's what billboards are made with, but we developed a way to be able to print. And I finally begged my way into a lab that really did not want me in there because they were understandably concerned I was going to break their printers. These are massive machines, and they've got real clients, not just artists that they have to work for. But all of those prints, the file is digital, and it is essentially a form of inkjet with a special ink.
Why do you use the wood? Why that medium?
You know, it's part of that sort of dialectical process that I live through. I didn't sort of cook up the idea. It's part of me. And I'm very interested in the intersection between the abstract world and the real world. I didn't get to talk about this collision with Clem as in Clement Greenberg. And Clem basically condemned me to hell for beginning to render realistic things in my abstract work. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me, that he sort of banished me from his circle. And part of the reason to use wood is that photography, although it can use a camera, you can use a camera with photography, but you can also work in the photographic medium in a darkroom, as I did. And one of the things I learned is that photography, although we think of it as a tool for realism, it actually does want to get to abstraction. And the wood, the grain of the wood, is a powerful element. And it literally, if you have the deepest perspective in any photograph, but you print on highly textured wood, you're going to collapse the space. And so the wood sort of, it almost creates an immovable object on the wall, a powerful physical object that denies the space of a photograph. And that collision is a very exciting thing for me, and I hope for others. The show that is up at Ryan Lee now is really about that. And it's about trying to have space, volume, mass collapsed onto a very strong physical presence, which is the wood. It's a very dynamic thing that occurs, and for me, very exciting.
Here's a question from Paula Hornbostel. She's asking, she says, you designed and patented your own large format camera, which I would like to hear more about. And she asked, do you let anyone else use it?
Yeah, it was pretty insane. I didn't mean to build it. I really tried to find a camera that could do what I wanted to do. And there just wasn't one that it was made. It didn't exist. After I built it and figured out how to use it and make prints, it took 2 years to build it and a couple of years to really figure out how to use it. I tried so hard to lend it to the National Geographic Society. They had backed some sort of colloquia and things that I had put on. And I turned to a couple of different groups to see if they would sort of adopt the camera, and I was willing to teach people how to use it. It just didn't fly. It's a very complicated camera to use, unfortunately. But I'm open to it. If somebody has a good idea and we can figure out that it's possible to help somebody make some art with it, I'm open.
I have a couple questions I'll try to put together. Jean is wondering if you're painting in oil again, and then someone anonymously is asking if the work behind you is a fusion of your painting and photography.
So I was going to show some little details of what I was doing. The work I've done for the last 5 years outside of photography and my video work is stayed sort of sequestered in my studio. This is my own sort of private fight. It has been. And I just thought for fun, there was something about Graham inviting me to be sort of involved with students learning. And I thought, well, I'm always still learning. And what's behind me is what I'm doing now. I'm not really game to talk about the materials because I'm just in such an exploratory phase. It just feels premature to sort of talk about what I'm doing at any length, but the person is correct that it is in fact a fusion of photography and painting. And I think I've been struggling with this battle for quite a few years. I went back to painting, and the first year of going back to painting was a disaster in the sense that I destroyed virtually everything I painted. It was so terrible. I'd lost my wrist with the years of work with a camera and everything else. And then something began to take hold. But I will say that this horrible period, this mad period with COVID, with its deaths and and I'm one of the lucky ones, but I definitely felt truly dented by this experience. I think that that drive to survive is part of what's happening now behind me, in that in the midst of the pandemic, I walked into the studio dutifully trying to get some work done, not feeling very optimistic. And I suddenly had a very simple, almost stupid idea about how to proceed. I'm pretty sure that this experience with COVID made me so desperate that I just leapt into a new spot, good or bad. But yeah, this is what I'm up to now, and I'm still working with photography and the digital media. But I needed to be alone with my materials and working with my hands. I missed it desperately.
There's a lot of comments that it's really inspirational talk, and I've got a couple of questions about the talk. The anonymous question is, could you talk more about what Goya and Titian share and why those two are so important to you?
Well, you know, they fuel me in very different ways. Titian, from beginning to end, pretty much, he was a miracle painter. I find it extremely difficult to dissemble his pictures to understand how he painted them. And I mean that in a craft sense, technically. The glazing, the layering, the way he feathers the brush, the pigments he used we don't have many of them today, but even how he used them was different than all of his contemporaries. And I feel not only an enormous kinship with that, well, the wonder that he gives me, I feel I'm connected to him. The great Titians are among the highest I can get. I mean, it's without drugs. And I don't do drugs, but it's sort of like, I just can't believe what Titian does in a painting. And I get high looking at those pictures. And I'm stunned by that long arc over a lifetime, from a devotion to the real world to finally allowing the materials almost to take hold and to win that dialectical battle. And at the end, he's in a land very close to the abstract expressionists and people like Pollock. It's just a miracle of paint with a flicker of imagery. And as to Goya, I didn't know much about Goya in 1979 when I went to Spain. I was visiting a dear friend of mine who coincidentally lent me a camera when I got interested in photography. He's a wonderful photographer named Clark Winter. And Clark was living in Spain, and I went to visit him in Madrid, and I went to the Prado, and I saw that painting. And I sort of had a collision with it the way I did with that Rembrandt some years earlier, probably was it 9 years earlier. And I looked at it, and I immediately, I mean, this hulking figure, it's almost like a Quasimodo kind of thing. The hulking figure is both dangerous in the sense, because it's so big, but there's something extremely sad about it. It's almost like he was scared. And looking at this version, in fact, why don't I go back to that one? That's the one. And with, his fist is raised, but in fact, I feel that the figure has turned away from the very people who are fleeing him in the foreground. Even the cows and cattle are running. And it's one of these moments of intensity, of miscommunication between everybody's scared, including the Colossus. And it is painted with such bravura, and you can feel the paint, but it's articulated. And in a way, I'm not sure, I actually think, if you'll pardon my saying it, Goya articulated the fuck you attitude that I needed to break free of Clement Greenberg's formalism. And there was just no denying that articulating a form and building an articulated landscape had meaning. And it isn't that I was not appreciative of realistic work before, but I was working in that formalist box, which was ridiculous. And Goya, and especially the black paintings for sure. The show up at the Met is filled with drawings and prints. And the idea of collapsing your means down, I obviously go very wide, but Goya keeps me honest. He keeps me honest in terms of trying to do things simply, with a modest number of means, rather than as wide as I would like to go. So he's an artist who teaches me rigor and deep feeling.
So there's a couple of questions here. One from Cynthia and another question from Ilsa, which I'll try and build on. But Cynthia is asking which female artists have inspired you.
Well, it's funny. It's sort of almost like a sucker punch for me, that one. That's great. Well, I grew up with one, so it would be preposterous not for me to acknowledge her. Helen Frankenthaler was my aunt, and there is no question that the magic that I saw as a child, which I had no interest in becoming an artist as a child, I discovered it while I was in college, oddly. But Helen had an enormous influence on me in terms of the magic of pursuing a life making things. And my connection to Clement Greenberg was through Helen. So Helen clearly was a big influence. And I would say, it's interesting, there's a great painting by Rosa Bonheur that's in the Met. It's a pretty well-known painting. But, these are sort of potentially tricky questions, not that the question was meant to be tricky, but tricky questions for me to answer as a male. But I have to admit that this is decades ago. When I first saw the painting, this galloping horses, it's one of the most powerful paintings in the Met. And when I went up to look at the label and I saw it was by Rosa Bonheur, and I thought, Rosa Bonheur, and I asked some people nearby and discovered it was a woman. And I was so flabbergasted and thrilled. And obviously with an aunt like Helen, I had no problems thinking about how great women could be making art or anything else. But it was a really interesting moment, going back a long way, where I had to have a sense of surprise that painting was by a woman. It dates my myself, I'm 68 years old, and people my age are, whether it is gender, whether it is race, whether it is issues of climate change. I'm not political with my art, but I am very much an activated citizen who rolls up his sleeves regarding all these issues. And I appreciate getting the question because I think, now that I think of it, it seems like every image that was shown was probably painted by a man. And I made that selection based on things that turned me on. I probably didn't use a painting of Helen's because one doesn't lead with one's aunt in telling a story. But thank you for the question.
So another follow-up question, and yeah, my friend and good painter Ilsa Murdoch pointed out what you just said, but she has a really great question here about the sublime, and she says, I'm very interested in the idea of the sublime, and I'm wondering how you feel it has changed since the Hudson River School painters who painted during the Industrial Revolution often painted out signs of the industry. So she goes on, she said, the idea of the sublime seems to contain the idea that nature will always overpower man, and this stirs up those feelings of awe. And it is only recently that we could see that man could have permanent damage on our own environment. How do you feel the idea of sublime now that our environment seems in many ways to be on the brink of collapse?
Yeah, it's a big, big question and a big, big issue. A number of years ago, there was a really interesting show at the International Center of Photography called Ecotopia. And most of the images in the show were of man, humankind, despoiling nature. I had one of my very large mountain landscapes in it. And there was a certain amount of criticism about what I was doing. The curator felt that in a certain way I was following in the steps of, let's say, Ansel Adams, because Ansel Adams was criticized. During World War II, he just kept photographing the mountains as if, you know, did he turn his back on the horrors of World War II? No, but he was very focused on something else. So today, first of all, the concept of sublime, for me, it has to do with nature. But I was with a guy named Theo Donnan recently, and he took me to a Japanese restaurant that I'd never been to. And we were served a meal, and there's no question that meal was sublime. So the concept of the sublime goes way past the issue we're talking about with nature. The sublime is actually, if you look it up, is Immanuel Kant wrote about it, Edmund Burke, and so on. It has to do with a feeling of being overwhelmed and unable to sort of cope with the experience in a way that heightens, through that almost anxiety or sense of wonder, it heightens one's feelings at a level that is not normal. Seeing the pyramids would be an example. So, you know, I feel in a sense, I'm a happy victim of what I am and who I am. I wish I could do more to directly address, other than as an activated citizen, issues like climate change and pollution and things, but I just don't take pictures that way. So I'm one of those people who is busy celebrating nature, even with my more abstract work, because I love what nature does to me. And I hope that if my work is often used for political reasons, and you know, people will show a hurricane wave, and you know, I used to think I was taking pictures of nature, and it was pointed out to me by a guy named Orville Schell that the photographs that I've been taking in the last 10 or 15 years, those waves were not just nature. Those hurricane waves are now being generated in part by man's impact on our planet. And sort of there was a sense of horror for me in a way that these works that I had done, they're the same works, but I suddenly look at them and I realize, my God, those damn photographs have now become a direct comment on on global warming, on you know, hurricanes. I was calling those, they're all called hurricane with a number, Hurricane 12, Hurricane 70. They're just numbered, and I called them hurricanes instead of waves because I wanted to sort of acknowledge the beautiful power of nature. And it turns out those hurricane waves are, at least some measure, due to this horror show that we've unleashed on the world by the Industrial Revolution, the continuing use of fossil fuels. And I guess I don't know if I'm hiding from reality by celebrating the sublime. There may be truth in that. But in celebrating the sublime, I hope I'm reminding people about what it is that we should be doing to experience the better elements of being humans on this planet, which is, let's save nature, let's make it possible to still have a wonderful Japanese meal. Much less, let's be sure everybody can eat. I mean, the questions of what we are in today as a species are so deep, I almost feel ill-equipped to deal with it in light of the art making. Not a very good answer, I'm afraid, to a good and important set of questions, but that's what I can offer tonight.
I think it's pretty interesting and complex. I have a couple more questions if you want to keep going for a little bit.
Sure.
Okay. This is an anonymous question. Do you think your amazing knowledge of art history ever negatively affects your own art?
I don't know how to answer the question because I couldn't know what it's like not to have been seduced by art history. Nature affects me as much as art. I am as affected by Melville and Wallace Stevens as I am by Titian and Goya. I have a lot of incoming. I'm hungry as a person. Does it limit me? Or does it impact negatively? Probably at times. Right now, I found myself, I was with somebody just about an hour ago who was sort of asking me about where some things came from. And I was sort of acknowledging art historical elements. And I think there are times when anything that's not coming from your heart is going to be something that's in the way. Cézanne always said all great paintings, something like this, all great paintings start with emotion. And if knowledge of art history ever got in the way of my emotion, I'd be in trouble. And there may be moments which I was unaware of where that was happening. As a younger artist, there was much more danger in it. I mean, Bill Bailey had me copying Rubens and Piero della Francesca and being as slavish as I could to earlier art. I think it served me well. Art turns me on, and literature turns me on. Movies turn me on, and I can't pretend that I'm a caveman who's been given a piece of charcoal from a fire and I'm wandering around in the Lascaux caves. I've got to live with the burden of all that enjoyment.
Well, I think I see there's A.M.A. Brown Price is wondering if you wouldn't mind showing a little bit of those images that you skipped over at the end. If you don't mind. But
no, I just, I don't want to keep everybody so late, but I can try and do it quickly.
Well, maybe just as we sort of wrap up, there's a lot of comments about how inspirational the talk has been, Clifford. Meredith Palmer is hoping to see the mural size work on wood at Mass MoCA, and there's a couple questions about where you could see Clifford's work right now. I mean, there's the show up at Ryan Lee, which I think is 26th Street in New York.
26th Street. It's between 10th and 11th. Ryan Lee Gallery, and yeah, there's it's an exhibition of wood prints on wood, and some quite small, but nothing quite at that scale. The work at Mass MoCA is not there permanently. It was part of an amazing opportunity that Joe Thompson, the director of the museum, gave me.
Are there any installations that we could up right now that one could go see?
You know, I'm never sure where there's work that from a collection that's up. The next exhibition I have is at the Portland Museum of Art in Maine. It's a fantastic museum, and they've given me a great opportunity. A curator there, Jessica May, has curated a survey which goes across a lot of media. It won't be physically as large as Mass MoCA, but she really went deep into areas that no one else has done. So come October, that'll be up in Maine. Maine is one of the greatest states in the union. So come on up to Maine and see that. I'm just going to go a step aside here and just say that this is a 12-foot painting. These are 6 by 10 inches. This is all those little marks at the bottom are those fleeing figures. This is all I could do in 1979 to try to grasp a landscape. And certainly, you know, art history didn't get in the way. Art history gave me a swift kick in the ass. And this is what came out of it. And it drove me to something that is relevant to the New York Studio School. I went back to school. I stopped showing for 4 years. I did go up to the National Academy of Design until I could sculpt completely realistically and paint realistically. I felt that was the antidote to the abstraction I grew up in. The figure on the top is my sculpture. I spent 1 year solidly working on her. And as you can see, in terms of art history getting in the way, I hadn't thought to address this when that question came up. But I was trying to figure out, there was something I was looking at. And oddly, I was inspired by an Anthony Caro abstract sculpture where the sculpture was bleeding off of its table. And I immediately was thinking about that amazing figure of Michelangelo's where literally the body is coming off. It's in the Medici Chapel. And I took, as you can see, the bottom of Michelangelo's figure, male figure, and then Matisse's Great Blue Nude that's in the Baltimore Museum. And her pose actually goes back to river goddesses and things. That business of art history fueling work, it certainly is a classical sort of figure, but that figure at the top enabled me to do all my abstract work.
Well,
that's you know, part of what's happening now is on the screen.
Is this a charcoal drawing?
You know, I just thought I'd throw it out there without.
Okay.
But in terms of being honest, I have not had anybody in my studio really, except my partner Nikki and her boys. That's kind of it. And there was something about Graham's invitation that made me think, just throw something out there, and so consider it thrown out.
All right. Well, Clifford, thank you so much for joining us and for being our closing artist of the spring. It's really a pleasure to have you and to see the work and see the videos and get a taste for your approach to working. Thank you all for joining us. And Clifford, if you want to have the last word, I'll toss it to you.
No, thank you to everybody that chose to join, and thanks Sam for helping me put this together, and of course to Graham, who I hope to see soon.
Yeah, we definitely hope you can next time you're around. We'll make that dinner happen on A Street that we miss so much. So thank you all for joining us.